we're focusing on sector-specific aspects of resilient infrastructure. Each session is jointly organized with respective sector groups from ADB's Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. In February's session, we explored business unusual for resilient urban infrastructure, which highlighted the importance of social capital, institutional context, and holistic approaches that account for uncertainty. Today, we are pleased to have with us a range of well-recognized experts and practitioners to discuss opportunities to progress towards resilient water systems for ADB's developing member countries. Before we get started, allow me to share the house rules for today. Please remain on mute throughout the presentations. Your questions and comments are very welcome. Please use the chat bar or the Q&A box for the questions and comments. Later in the session, we will split into different breakout rooms to look at the topics in more detail. You will have the option to select one of the 3 breakout rooms. In preparation for this, we're now sharing on screen the instructions for how to select your preferred room. Just to note, this webinar is being recorded and the video will be shared on the event website along with the presentations and a summary in the next day or so. I will now hand over to my colleague Sugar Gonzalez for an audience poll. Sugar, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Carol. So I'll going to launch our poll question. And our question is, which approach is most important to enhance water system resilience? So I'd like to invite everyone to answer the question. You can choose either risk-informed governance, resilient infrastructure standards, nature-based solutions, forecasting and early warning systems, capacity building, or if you think that there are other ideas that were not captured, you can choose others. So maybe we can wait more. All right, so maybe we can end our poll now and share the results with you. So based on our the results of this poll, we see that many of us have identified that risk-informed governance and resilient infrastructure standards are the 2 main important approaches to enhance the water system, followed by nature-based solutions, forecasting and early warning systems, and other chose capacity building. So thank you for answering this poll. So over to you again, Carl.
Thank you, Sugar. And thank you everyone for taking part in the poll. Very interesting indeed. So to get us started and to frame today's session, it's my pleasure to invite John Matthews to set the scene. John Matthews is the Executive Director and co-founder of the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation. Since 2003, he has integrated technical and policy approaches for water and climate resilience over 5 continents in more than 30 countries. John is also a Senior Water Fellow at Colorado State University and Water Resources Courtesy Faculty at Oregon State University. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Coral. I'm really grateful to have been invited to speak at this session and to help introduce and frame the issue. The topic is both really critical and really challenging. One of my favorite stories about the subject actually comes from my first job in which adaptation was part of my job title. This was back in 2007, and I took a trip to China with a small team of national staff. I was traveling around the country, a number of cities. It was a bitter cold winter. I remember giving talks indoors with my winter coat on. talking about climate change, water, and resilience. And at the end of the talk, we were literally on our way to the airport so I could come back home. One of the translators said, we feel like we need to tell you that we translated the word resilience in all of your talks, but in Mandarin, the word resilience doesn't mean very much. And I thought for a minute, and I said, well, I don't think it means very much in English either, unfortunately. And I think that there's still something that's deeply true about that statement, that we're still in the process of trying to define actually what resilience means in general, and especially what it means in the context of water. I'm going to be a little risky, and I'm going to say what I think it means, and I'm going to use it in contrast to the word sustainability. We've been talking with the Millennium Development Goals, with the Sustainable Development Goals after that, and even longer in the water community back into the early 1990s about sustainable water resources management as a kind of definitive practice. If you look at what most people are doing, is they're trying to define a specific set of targets and goals for sustainability. I think what that implies is that we're seeing one future that we're headed towards, that we're looking at one vision of what the future can and should look like. I would contrast resilience by saying that resilience is much more of a process, that it's trying to think about multiple futures and potentially a range of different options that we're trying to steer between to navigate as a process. So instead of a specific set of numeric targets, I think that this concept of resilience as a process is a really important one, because unfortunately, most of how we have used to try to constrain the future doesn't work that well in the context of water management decision making. The past is a very poor predictor of the future now for many aspects of water management. And worse, most climate models are really horrible in terms of having consistent patterns that we can use in our decision making. And so this sense of process is actually really critical to how we think about trying to implement and define what water resilient infrastructure looks like in reality. I'm going to end with just a last observation. Is it new? I actually think in many ways, water resilience is returning to the past. And one of my favorite examples is from Sichuan province, another Chinese story, the Zhujiangyang irrigation facility, place that I get really excited about as a water nerd. It was designed by a single water engineer around 250 BC, more than 2,000 years ago, has an integrated fish ladder. It served millions of people across many dynasties and even minor climate shifts. That's an impressive piece of infrastructure, but it's never been fixed. It's always been adjusted and modified and repaired, that it's had an integrated governance and management system. And that's a powerful lesson for how a piece of infrastructure has been able to serve consistently and effectively, how it's been able to sit well in its landscape, and how it's been able to meet shifting expectations as well as a shifting climate and environment. And that's a powerful idea for us today to return to in many ways. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much for that scene setting talk, which is certainly food for thought, and especially those applied anecdotes I think are really telling. So thank you so much. We'll now move on to the burst talk section of this event. The first talk on resilience to floods will be made by Jeff Wilson from the ADB. Jeff is a senior water resources specialist with ADB. He's a professional civil engineer with over 30 years of experience in the sector. Jeff's current position is within the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department of ADB, where he provides advice and supports project preparation for a variety of water-related projects. Jeff, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Carol. And thanks, John, for those opening remarks. They were interesting. If we can just go to the first slide. Thank you. Okay. So good day, everyone. My name's Jeff Wilson. Well, to get started, there's a couple of points about this title that I'd like to make before we start. Firstly, we should not be trying to resist floods. We should be resilient to floods. So we cannot resist floods. Well, not economically anyway. If we were to protect to say the 1 in 100 year event, there's still a 1% chance of flooding, and that's 1% every year. So we need systems that will provide flood protection for the smaller frequent events, and we need systems that can safely pass the most extreme events safely for the prevention of loss of life. And resilience. What is this term resilience? We hear a lot about it these days, and for good reason. So there are various definitions of resilience, but they all boil down to pretty much the same thing. Simplistically, it's the capacity of the system to continue to provide its function in the face of short-term shocks and long-term stresses. So in the context of flood resilience, the function is efficient flood risk management. The short-term shocks are flood events, and the long-term stresses are climate change, land use change, population growth, and even financing, or perhaps I should say that the lack of financing. And for the system, what is the system? Well, the system is an overarching term, and it includes everything: physical, financial, social, and the environmental components. Next slide, please. So resilience to floods is multidimensional, and I've prepared a framework here for flood resilience. I hope it's not too small for you to see. In this framework, we have the stresses and the shocks as rows, and the 4 components of the system I just mentioned as columns. So to be truly resilient, we would need to address every cell in this matrix. So I don't have time to go through every cell, so let's just look at a couple of the most important ones. We need flood infrastructure, yes, and perhaps we can use nature-based solutions, and perhaps we can provide room for the river. But importantly, we need strong and reliable institutions, and this is where our non-structural measures come in. So here I'm talking about land use planning. So knowing the risky areas and knowing the right land uses to be put into those areas. Building codes, making sure our buildings are built according to what flood shocks they might encounter. But I think it's more than this. It's about having strong governance. It's about having strong communities and protecting the most vulnerable. We need to invest in capacity building, our capacity building for our formal and our informal institutions. If we're truly flood resilient, then before any event occurs, we have planned and budgeted for maintenance works. And we have invested in maintaining our rivers, canals, and drainage systems. We have an informed and well-prepared community who know what to do in the case of an extreme event. We may have set up a flood forecasting system. We've identified evacuation routes and possibly even constructed flood shelters, which are sensitive to the safety and respect of all those who need to use them. And these flood shelters may even double as schools or community halls, as in the case of the typhoon shelters in Bangladesh, along the coast of Bay of Bengal. If the flood event is extreme, then post-disaster financing might kick in, or we might have been smart enough to put in place parametric insurance or contingent disaster financing facilities, like we have for 10 Pacific countries covering disasters triggered by natural hazards and health emergencies. And these disperse payments within days rather than waiting for months, as was previously the case. And then we might even be smart enough to build back better, maybe not in the same place, or maybe in the same place, but now with better knowledge of the risks, of the flood heights, of the flood velocities, and appropriate responses. So by investing in flood resilience, we're primarily investing in the lives and the safety of our community. And we're attempting to reduce the direct and the indirect losses. All this with limited financial resources. And so we need financial and forward planning. And we need to be efficient and we need to be smart. Next slide, please. Now, about being efficient and smart, I'd like to talk a little bit about room for the river. Again, this is a term which you hear a lot about these days. Efficient flood risk management is all about balancing the storage of water, that's the storage in, say, the floodplains, against the conveyance of the water. That's the ability of the river to move the water downstream. So it's a balance between storage and conveyance. And both these mechanisms require space. So when you're designing flood mitigation works, you need room, and you might be needing somebody's land. So we need to be smart about this. We can use reservoirs, but they're expensive. So we need to operate existing reservoirs smarter, using real-time forecasting and control, and squeeze more out of them. And we need to design floodplain storage which has multiple users, areas which can be used productively for the 99.9% of the time when they're not needed for the flood, but are available for the 0.1% of the time that they are needed. Or we could take this opportunity and introduce some environmental or nature-based solution components. For example, the mangroves that we're looking at for flood control, flood risk mitigation in Fiji. Consider land beside the floodplain, which frequently floods as it's currently farmed by the landowner. We may need some of that land to be earmarked for flood storage or conveyance as part of our flood risk management plan. In many cases, that land needs to be put into local government ownership, but now the land is no longer used for agriculture or anything else. This is not efficient. Yet in many cases, this is what we are facing. We need to be innovative. Next slide, please. So just some final words on flood resilience. Our flood resilience systems need to have the capacity for adaptation, for learning, and for transformation. And in the future, we will need to deal with climate change, population growth, and land use change. And these are huge unknowns. So our systems must be adaptive to the uncertainties of the future. We don't want to invest in stranded infrastructure, which we find is no longer suitable under a new climate or a new population distribution, or a weak and an ineffective institution. Some new analysis methodologies are being promoted, and you may have heard of these bottom-up approaches like dynamic adaptive pathways planning. These approaches show great promise, and we should be looking at them in situations where the consequences of a highly uncertain future is great, be that with climate change or population growth. So my main message, which I want to get across, is that flood resilience is not only about infrastructure. It's also about having strong and resilient financial systems and capable institutions, strong and social and community responsibility, and an awareness of the environmental dimension. and we need to plan where our floods go so we don't plan to live there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jeff. That was really very interesting and indeed important messages across when it comes to flood resilience. So next, I would like to invite Amit Singh to provide some reflections. Amit is an IHE Delft alumni who has worked across the private, public sector, and regional organizations, including the government of Fiji. Amit, what issues do Pacific countries face when building resilience to floods?
Okay, thank you. I'm really glad to be here on this webinar and discussing the issues we from the region face with regards to building resilience to the flood. Yeah. So as I allude to what Jeff has said, and would like to take further break it down and really point out issues that we face in the region when we are trying to build resilience to the flood. And I'll start with, there was a study done in 2016 by a group of geographers who were looking at flood losses with regards to different impacts of climate change. So for moderate climate change, it was found out that for Fiji, flood losses would increase by 90%. And for severe impact, it would have the flood losses would increase by 275%. That's a lot. If you take countries like, for example, Fiji, Fiji, Samoa, all these countries that are of volcanic origin and they have rivers, there's always an element of flood risk in these countries. So for the issues we face when building resilience to the flood range from climate change to the narrative of climate change and the relationship with flood. And I'm going to quickly go through some of these. One of the first one I would say is the fragmentation of roles and responsibilities of agencies that look or are managing rivers. Decisions, let's say river management is fragmented in most of the countries. Multiple agencies often have jurisdictions along different sections of the river. There is multiple legislation that is administered by multiple agencies, and as such, overall coordinated efforts towards flood management is lost. There is a lack of water management legislation, including flood risk management and planning in most of the Pacific Island countries. And this is very serious. What this leads to is this leads to uncoordinated developments in floodplain. There's people building in places that usually flood, and they keep on building there. There's also backfilling of floodplains, which moves water to other places, and you often hear people saying, during flood 2 years ago, my house didn't flood, but in this flood it has flooded. One of the reasons for that is, backfilling in areas where it's not supposed to be backfilled, because and the reason they do that is because backfilling is not regulated. One of the other issues we face here is because there is lack of capacity in terms of doing flood risk mapping, in terms of data, in terms of the skills at various level, including institutional capacity and technical and managerial skills in flood mapping. There is absence of flood maps in most of the peaks. Flood risk map is absent, and that doesn't allow for coordinated planned development in the areas that are associated with flooding, and that allows people to build in these areas and continue facing that risk of being flooded after every rainfall event. One of the other things I want to discuss today is the lack of comprehension of flood management. We may have good disaster risk management regulations, laws, bylaws, but flood hazard maps and plans, local plans, standard operating procedures are missing. What is required before flood seems to have been looked at in a very, let's say, minute, in a very um, not in a detailed manner, then those things that they're supposed to kick in after a flood. So there's more emphasis on when the flood has occurred and after, then actually preparing for a flood. And often the resources that are needed to prepare for a flood is often left to few agencies or ministries to prepare the country, to prepare the nation for the upcoming wet season. And the last one I want to discuss today is the narrative of the narrative of climate change and floods are not explored yet. In the region, we find the notions that are sellable are often related to global discourses, and you won't. It's very hard to connect flood and climate change and package that together, and then try and raise awareness, try and sell it as a concept for funding for projects in the region. We need more projects like the recent GCF project, integrated flood management in Vaisingano River catchment in Samoa. We need more projects like the flood alleviation project. So these are some of the issues we are facing and the things that I would like to share today through this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amit. Those are very, very important reflections, and your knowledge around the Pacific specificities are really, really complementary to the presentation so far. So thank you very much. The second verse talk on drought resilience will be made by Yeli Beckma, a senior water resources specialist with ADB's Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. Yeli has over 30 years of experience in irrigation, drainage, water security, and sanitation. Yeli, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Coral. I'll be sharing my screen. Thank you, John, as well. I like the example that you gave on China. If you've ever seen that system, you never forget it. When you look from the height on this system that's already been there for more than 1,000 years. I have the pleasure today to share with you some examples on the resilience for drought. And I want to do that on the basis of a number of examples that we have at the Asian Development Bank, and also to put a few critical points. I have chosen 3 points. Irrigation, of course, the most sort of logical drought resilience measure that we can think of. We have to only think of the system that John was talking about that's already existing for more than thousands of years. We have to think of protective irrigation in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, where we tried to at least do something, or where in colonial times it was tried to do something against the dry season that is in between the monsoons to keep on producing. And what we're looking at today is, of course, a bit more the resilience towards climate change, as it has become much more important. Then we go to water harvesting and watershed management. What you can do with techniques for watershed management is additional water retention. You can reduce extremes in drought as well as in floods. And a last point that's a bit counterintuitive maybe, but also drainage is needed. Yeah, if you have higher efficiency that we look at to use the water better and have higher resilience against drought, and you have high productivity, this may result in salt accumulation. And if you have salt accumulation, you need leaching to get rid of these salts. And if leaching exceeds the natural drainage, you need an artificial drainage. So it might be that for drought control, you actually need also drainage. Here I show with you a number of development stages and a number of projects that we have in the ADB that are maybe illustrative for these development stages. If you look from the left to the right, where the arrow is getting much bigger, we go to systems that are more focused towards resilience. And on the left bottom, you see for example, redeveloping irrigation, redeveloping because sometimes it existed already and it's rebuilt, or complete new irrigation. You can think of countries like Cambodia and Mongolia where we do that, although there are, of course, also ranges. Sometimes we do some things that are very, very sophisticated in these countries too. Rehabilitation and modernizing of infrastructure. Again, we look at food security, poverty alleviation, Indonesia, Uzbekistan are countries where we do projects like that. Then service delivery, we start looking a little bit more at how good we can provide services, and that is also related, of course, to drought resilience. If there's more water needed, we can deliver more water. India projects come to mind. We look at income generation, we look at economic growth. And then finally, the summum of resilience maybe, where farmers are completely involved in all the different action, where we have a sort of handoff approach. It's all done maybe through internet systems. We have a high climate resilience. We look at environmental issues, social inclusiveness, economic growth, and some of the projects that we're doing in Vietnam and the People's Republic of China come to mind. Here you see a illustration of one of these projects in Vietnam. Water efficiency improvement in drought-affected provinces. On the left top, you see a very standardized sort of irrigation system where we just use the hose and give water. Then we go a step further where we look at sprinkle irrigation systems with a pipe. And on the bottom, you see a fully sort of modernized system with drip irrigation and having mangoes where before there were rice fields that were using lots of water, and now we have a high income from mango, one of the projects that we are doing. Then the next one shows a project that we're doing in Madhya Pradesh, where you look at a very sophisticated system. We pump the water to a distribution channel, we go to a main pipe, secondary, if you go to the right, tertiary, quaternary, and we come closer and closer to the farms. And in each of the different distribution points, you'll have a supervisory control and data acquisition, a SCADA system, to give you information. If we go then to the water harvesting, it's a little bit more looking into watersheds, watershed development, watershed protection. We think of things like terraces, if we look at infrastructure, tanks where we store the water, check dams, vegetation strips between different fields, and of course caption of the water and leading it to fields, which is sometimes quite a challenge. Here you see a project that we're doing in Henan, Sichuan, integrated ecological protection. And what I found very nice is on the top you see a sort of water harvesting system where we have tanks and collection tanks at different elevations. And the beauty is that we can use this elevation to pressurize systems. If you look at the bottom, what does such a pressurized system do? On the right-hand side, you see an area without irrigation. There's hardly anything growing. Then we have the traditional sort of flood irrigation. It's better growing, but there's still not very high trees. And on the left, you see fully grown trees with a drip irrigation system. So you get much better yields with the same amount of water. Now, if we get this high efficiency and this high productivity, one of the problems that we have is shown in this slide. On the left-hand side, you see the sort of traditional surface irrigation. In the middle, you see sprinkler irrigation, already much more efficient. And on the right-hand side, you see the drip irrigation that we just showed. Everywhere we have the same amount of irrigation coming, but you see that if we have surface irrigation, we lose 40 to 50% of the water to a drain flow. That takes the salts out, and the salts are leached from the profile. Sprinkler irrigation, we have only 10 to 20%, and drip irrigation, 0 to 10% of drainage flow. Now, if the drain flow is less than 10 to 20%, particularly in arid regions, we need extra irrigation to leach the salts. And if we have a natural drainage on very permeable soils with a deep drainage base, it's no problem. The water will drain and it's gone. But if it's not so permeable, we need a drainage system. And I show you here 4 types of drainage systems. If we have a surface drainage system, problem is that once it reaches the groundwater, it starts collapsing. If we have vertical drainage, we pump it out, we mobilize salts in the groundwater. So the best is a horizontal drainage system where you have permeable pipes in the fields that drain into well-lined sort of surface system, a composite system that then gets rid of the water and the salts that are dissolved in it. Now, these were all examples of infrastructure, and of course, it's not infrastructure alone. Already, Jeff also mentioned very clearly, and it's a multidimensional system. A few things that are really important is, of course, an enabling environment and policies, and I'm glad to mention that in our water sector framework for 2030, we have this as a very important theme. Governance is important, water users involved in everything, a good agency that is managing everything, and particularly also maintenance. And there we have to think, the more sophisticated our systems, the more complicated our maintenance, and the more capacity is also needed to do a proper maintenance. Again, this is part of our water sector framework for the coming 10 years. Then, of course, if we talk about agriculture and food security, value chain and marketing are very important elements as well. Thank you very much for your attention. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you. Over to Coral, I think.
Thank you very much, Jelle. Extremely interesting presentation with a good combination of project examples and concepts. So thank you for that in connection to the future. Next, I'd like to invite Medani Yaya Kodi to provide some reflections. Medani is the Chief Engineer, Water Resources Planning with the Department of Irrigation in Sri Lanka. Medani, could you please share with us what actions are being taken by the government of Sri Lanka to enhance the resilience of irrigation and water-fed agriculture systems to droughts?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Good afternoon, everybody. As Sri Lanka, we have a lot of projects and programs are doing to enhance the drought resilience. So we are doing comprehensive river basin level studies to identify the structural and non-structural solutions for drought mitigation in irrigation and water-fed systems. We started this with the PRIP project, and we identified the solutions like storage tanks, trans-basin diversions, crop diversification for maximum water usage, and developing guidelines for better operation systems. Because of we are a country having seasonal rainfalls with northeast and southwest dry zones, we are not getting evenly distributed rainfalls during the whole year. Some dry zone areas we are getting about 5 months drought or the dry period. So we need storage facilities for that. So we have under new infrastructure development under Mahaveli Water Security Investment Program, we are diverting Mahaveli waters to the north central and the northwestern dry zone areas of the country. Then we have some Lower Malvatwe reservoir, which is under implementation stage to increase the cropping intensity of the very dry, severely dry area of the country, the Mena district. And the Nilwala diversion project is going to implement to bring the wet zone waters to the southeast dry zone of the country. And under rehabilitations of the existing irrigation schemes, and we propose some modernization, improved agriculture productivity and agriculture practices for the climate resilience. Under that, climate resilient integrated water management project, 3 river basins were selected, Yanoya, Maoya and Mioya, in the north east and north central dry zones, and further under integrated water productivity improvement project, northwestern and the provinces, which are also having very dry conditions during part of the year. Four since identified to improve the use efficiency. Then under climate smart agriculture project under the agriculture department, also going to improve the agriculture practices for the resilience and the agriculture productivity improvement in the eastern, north central and Ua provinces. And then we are waiting for the CREST MPA project, which is going to improve the water with the forecasting system with the meteorological department and the irrigation department. Then we can move on the better water management and operation system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Medani. Those were very practical examples and that application and that really geographical diversity of measures. It's very important for us to hear. So we will keep going, and the third burst talk today is going to be on resilient water and sanitation during COVID-19, and it will be made by Isaka Kimura, who will share experiences from ADB's private sector operations. Isaka is an advisor to Private Sector Operations Department of Asian Development Bank with over 25 years of experience in arranging finance for energy, natural resources, water, and municipal environmental infrastructure projects in various countries, including East Asia, Russia, Central and Eastern Europe. Isaka, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for a kind introduction. Good afternoon. My name is Isaka Kimura. I'm a banker located in the field office. I'm very pleased to be here today to talk about private sector's role in resilience, which has been very close to my heart. When COVID-19 started, I decided to stay in the epicenter of pandemic so that I can work closely with our clients and devote myself for emergency response. Today, I'd like to share with you my observation based on our operations and also discussion with private sector water leaders who are stepping up to cope with the pandemic to ensure 24 hours, 7 days safe water services. You may wonder why private sector. Indeed, private sector participation in water operation is very limited compared to other sectors such as energy. Alongside ADB public sector operations policy advice to the government, we are encouraging private and also private sector participation as well as public-private partnership, PPP, because we believe water agenda would need broad range of solutions, including private sectors, to meet the goals. The private sector plays a role as a project sponsor and also source of innovation that can yield transformative solutions. With relying more on private sector, the government can free up significant amount of funds to its critical expenditure related to social concerns such as pandemic response. Now, let me start sharing some slides. Here are our focus before COVID-19. We focus on resilience, as our previous speaker talked about. We focus on resilience of infrastructure to climate and weather-related risks, such as smart water technology in particular, forecast and provide early warning for urban flooding, improve operation, overall efficiency, and also planning for network extension, and detect and quickly react to incident and leakage, monitor water quality, quantity, and also automated operation. and climate and disaster resilient technique to mitigate urban flooding caused by excessive rainfall, and wastewater reuse as a cost-effective solution to water scarcity. And every project we finance, we improved water efficiency. What happened during lockdowns soon after COVID-19 pandemic? Next slide, please. In short, many governments identify the water and wastewater industry, I think it's the same for your country, as essential and let operate even during lockdown with minimum critical staff on site. Digital solutions play a critical role during lockdown, not only operations, but also customer interface such as invoicing and payment. ADB has been financing the project with advanced technologies, even private sectors. And indeed, those technologies help water and wastewater projects continue essential services during lockdown. We observe some adjustment such as additional support to vulnerable people with free water and water kiosks, and also enhanced safety and increased quality testing frequency and also location. Even during lockdown, ADB continued financing new investment opportunities to upgrade the existing water plant to meet higher quality standard, and also test new solutions to prepare for next wave of pandemic. Next slide, please. Here is my last slide. I'd like to share with you some lessons learned so far. Following COVID-19, resilience jumped up the agenda. Also, definition has broadened. The pandemic demonstrated that some infrastructure can come under significant strains during unexpected factors such as supply chain and logistic disruption, which would cause delay in construction and maintenance. Unexpected demand fluctuation, such as industrial and commercial user under lockdown, is ongoing, and also longer lead time to obtain government approval and licenses. End user payment moratorium, some countries allow end user to payment later or even cancel payment, and also deferring water and sanitation bill. Those of course cause increasing working capital requirement of the utility company. And lastly, but not least, we observe significant delay in commercial banks approval process. So each water utility should upgrade the resilience plan and activity to cope of this uncertainty. ADB will keep helping raise awareness of resilience, and also any action plan and activity to respond to those wider range of risks in addition to climate. And indeed, coping with COVID-19 is a long journey, but I personally witnessed in epicenter, this is a domino effect. Some successful case encourage more water utility and local government to try new solutions to build back better. And knowledge sharing is very crucial in this journey. Thank you so much for opportunity, and I really look forward to exchanging view with you in breakout session. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Isaka, for that excellent presentation and the perspective of the private sector, as well as the pre and post COVID-19 angle to the resilience dialogue for the water sector. So thank you very much. We have a little bit of time before we go into the next phase of the presentation today, which is the breakout rooms. So I would like to encourage anyone who might have a question for Isaka or any of our other speakers up to this point to raise the hand or incorporate it into the chat box at this time. I think it's fine. Otherwise, we can discuss these things more in more detail and all the questions and comments during the breakout rooms. So perhaps we can start with the breakout rooms earlier. And then so we will move to those 3 breakout rooms to continue the discussion. Each one will be moderated by one of today's presenters. This is an opportunity to share and discuss further how to conceptualize resilient water systems. We have 3 breakout rooms. The first one focuses on resilience to floods. The second one focuses on drought resilience. And the third one focuses on resilient water and sanitation during COVID-19. I would kindly ask you to please select your preferred room when a prompt arises on the screen. And if you have an issue selecting a room, you will be assigned to a random room in about 1 minute time. Once you're in the breakout room, please turn on your camera and if possible, and also remain on mute when you're not speaking. We'll convene back here in around 15 minutes to share some of the key takeaways. So now we will open the breakout rooms. So welcome back, everyone. Hope that you all had rich discussions in your breakout rooms. Certainly we did in ours. And I'd like to invite each of the presenters to share one key takeaway from the group discussions. So let me start by asking group 1 and Jeff Wilson to share the one key takeaway in terms of resilience to floods. Over to you, Jeff.
One key takeaway, that's really difficult. I think it all comes down to what Stephen said on enabling environment. There's so much going on. I think you could put it under that umbrella of having an enabling environment for resilient floods, and you put under that institutional capacity, education, training, investment, risk management plans, flood risk maps, land tenure, and urban flood resilience. It all comes under this enabling environment. So thanks, Stephen, for allowing me to steal those words from you. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks, Group 1. So now over to Group 2. Yele, please, if you could summarize maybe with one key takeaway, the discussion around drought resilience. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's never an easy task, but we were lucky to have Medani in our group, who I think came immediately with, already during her answer, with something really important, the need to do comprehensive planning, to look integrated into the water resources and to use predictive models together with the observations that you have to really be able to address it at the moment. And then John Matthews added to that the adaptation pathways to be open for multiple solutions and not just look at one sort of optimal that we're doing at the moment. So I think it's really comprehensive planning and being able thereby to prepare for unknown events that we have in the future that we're so worried about. We don't know exactly what's going to happen. And to have the flexibility to actually react on that with the information that is needed to make the right decisions. So I think that sort of summarizes the main finding in our group. Thank you.
Thank you, Yele. And now if we could ask Isaka, please, to summarize for us the discussion for Group 3 around the resilient water sanitation during COVID-19. Thank you, Isaka.
Thank you. My key takeaway from group discussion is private sector operational flexibility to respond to demand fluctuation during lockdown, household demand, and also commercial and industrial demand change during lockdown. It's an ongoing issue. And also how private sector can be flexibly respond to several cases, such as rural mini grid networks, and also series of infrastructure, not only single plant, but multiple treatment plant and networks. And also bad example, which brought the private sector in financial distress, and also some specific technical issues such as tariff formula, including foreign currency risk. And also lastly, a very important point is the scope of private sector participation to include green solution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isaka. And thank you again to our group leaders and groups for discussing these very important topics on the side of the main presentations and bursts and discussions. So I think it's time to close the event and to bring the session to a close. Aside from the key takeaways we just heard about, I think we can also remind ourselves of the key takeaways of the presentations and discussions we had before the discussion groups or breakout rooms. We heard a lot about how resilience is a process indeed, that is not a new process, but it is a process, and that resilience is a multidimensional process that is obviously going to require that we think about innovation, we think about adaptive ways to do it, that it's not purely about infrastructure, as we've heard many, many times today, but that we have to think about the financial and governance systems, the institutional capacity, the capacity in general, the community participation, and environmental dimensions as well. That of course we also have to realize that it can be a process that has different development stages, and that we need to oftentimes go along that development pathways in order to get to the final goal in terms of resilience. That indeed, we have to again think about the enabling environment as a whole, with the policies and the governance and the data requirements and the maintenance requirements and the capacity associated with that. And that the private sector has an important role, and that COVID-19 has taught us that resilience planning indeed has to be upgraded to cope with uncertainty. So I think that, along with the key takeaways we just heard from the discussion groups, are some of the rich ideas and thoughts that we heard about today. So I would like to particularly thank our presenters and our speakers for sharing their work and for moderating the breakout discussions. And thank you to all the participants for your engagement throughout today's webinar. I want to also make an announcement that the next virtual dialogue on resilient infrastructure will be convened by ADB on Wednesday, 28th of April at 2 p.m. Manila time, and it will be titled Building Resilience of the Power System in the Low Carbon Transition. You can find the registration link in the chat bar for this subsequent virtual dialogue on resilient infrastructure, and I really hope you can make it. And also to note is that all of today's presentations and other resources, including a recording and a summary of the event, will be posted on the website shortly. So thank you again to everyone, and I really wish everyone to stay safe and a very good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.